Thank you, John. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Quite an interesting topic. I know I'm the last speaker in the list, so very limited things to say. But I thought that the best approach to share my views with you on this topic is to take you through the Malta experience and what Malta has done over these last 30 years to come to where it is today. I've been in banking for 30 years. I work in a local bank, Bank of Valletta, which commands around 45% market share of the market in Malta. And I distinctly remember when joining the bank in 1985, the banks in Malta, a handful of banks, literally on one hand, were predominantly servicing the domestic market. So very domestically orientated banks, providing for deposits and a degree of lending, full stop. But then there were some developments over the years, which changed, it was a paradigm shift actually, it changed the nature of our economy. And clearly the decision taken by government in the late 80s to initiate the process for Malta to become a member of the EU, that was the beginning of our financial services industry, which is, in my view, the backbone of any sound economy, supported by a sound banking sector and by quite active capital markets in Malta, which helped the development of infrastructure in Malta. It was not easy. Malta was an offshore jurisdiction at that time, and literally the decision meant that we had to overhaul our legal and regulatory framework. And we did that in a big bang approach. So in 1994, Parliament unanimously overhauled the framework, the legal and regulatory framework, and enacted some 14 pieces of legislation. And that shifted us from an offshore positioning to an onshore one. And it paved the way for the development of the economy and the industry as we know it today. True enough, there were some interesting milestones, additional milestones in the process. So I'd say for the first 10 years up to actual membership, which took place in 2004, the industry, driven by the banks themselves, was very much driven by financial institutions and the local banks that entered the frame. So they started developing financial services business, entering into wealth management, into custody, into asset management, but servicing the domestic market. Being active with the corporates, we had the launch of the exchange in 1991, started seeing government paper come to the market, then we started actively seeing corporate paper, and it's quite an active market for the size of our country, 316 square kilometers. Then the adoption of the euro in 2008, and you fast forward that to today, 2016. A financial services industry which used to contribute just 3% to GDP in the 90s. It's actually less than agriculture. It used to contribute 5% at that time. Today it contributes 12% to GDP and employs some 10,000 people. And I think the Malta experience is an experience that can be mirrored in these developing countries. There were a number of critical success factors that underpinned the development of Malta as a financial services jurisdiction. We're not blessed, unfortunately, with oil reserves or gas reserves, nothing of the sort, no commodities, nothing whatsoever. We're very much a service-centered economy. And so there was a significant investment in education. When I say significant, to the tune that successive governments literally pay students to seek tertiary education. They pay students to go to university. They finance master programs for students. And that has been a significant investment which has paid off. Because one of the critical success factors that has elevated the position of Malta as a financial center, and on the back of which we've seen quite a number of credit and financial institutions set up shop in Malta. Today there are about 66 credit and financial institutions on the island. A number of them, I'd say about 10 or 12, they are servicing the domestic market, but the rest, they're doing financing and treasury operations and trade finance operations from Malta abroad, servicing, most of them, the region, both to our north, so the countries in the Med-Rim, but also particularly the countries to our south and the southeast fascia of the Mediterranean. And I think this investment, the investment in education, the development of a supporting infrastructure, because then this started attracting the service providers. So we have the top 4 audit firms here, we have the medium-tier audit firms here. The setting up of a number of legal firms that supported the industry. A single regulator, very bold decision taken by the government to ensure that we have one single regulatory body. which facilitated the development of financial instruments, facilitated the listing of instruments on the exchange. And I think the Malta experience is always an interesting case study. When I visit countries which are still developing, they have maybe a less developed capital market, a less sophisticated banking sector, and you can see the opportunities. The Prime Minister of Malta led a delegation to Algeria very recently, and quite a number of Maltese went to visit this country. And they saw with their eyes the opportunities that could be developed in this market. And this is the knowledge, I think, that Malta can impart to these countries to develop their capital markets, to develop their banking sectors, but also in other areas. Because clearly the development of our financial center has clearly benefited other economic sectors. What are the challenges for banks to finance business today? Clearly, when you look at the spate of regulation that has hit credit institutions over these last 7-8 years, it's significant. And I think today the challenge for banks to finance projects is driven by the fact that we have the risk appetite of the banks where there is a mismatch with the risk profile of these projects. And the reason is very simple. Because when you start financing certain projects, you need capital allowances. And that means that if you don't have sufficient capital on your balance sheet, you need to go to the market to raise capital. So banks are literally risking. And it is a pity that banks are actually placing their deposits with the European Central Bank at negative interest. Whilst, as we all know, that banks in Europe are being criticized for not lending actively to SMEs and financing SME operations. Let me be optimistic, and then on an optimistic note. Are there solutions? Yes, there are. I think there are a number of vehicles that could be structured. Some were mentioned in the previous panel discussion. The use of securitization vehicles, the use of guarantees, the use of long-term investment funds, which I think are excellent vehicles to mobilize personal capital to projects, to such long-term projects. We're also discussing the need for a development bank in Malta, and it has been voiced in the previous sessions that ultimately it is possible that we need a development bank covering the Mediterranean region. I'll end on that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Several ideas emerging from that discussion for how things could be improved.